Welcome to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If you want effective and actionable tips to simplify the overwhelm of launching and managing your podcast, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Verity Songon, podcast manager, launch strategist, and host of a Top 100 podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, so without further ado, let's dive into the episode. Hello there, and welcome to the first episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. I'm so excited to bring this podcast to you. This has been a passion project of mine for quite some time. And those of you who already know me will know that I already host the Confident CEO podcast, which has seen some amazing success in the last year. Well, the first 8 months, we routinely hit the top 250 podcasts for various countries around the world for business entrepreneurship podcasts in Apple Podcasts, and we routinely are hitting the UK top 100 for a business entrepreneurship podcast as well. So I found that the more that I was podcasting with the Confident CEO podcast, more and more people were coming to me and being like, but Verity, how do you start a podcast? How do you create a podcast? I really want to know how you did this, basically. What are your secrets? And I'm going to tell you there are no secrets, but on speaking to a friend, I ended up really inspired to create another podcast, which, one podcast is enough work. 2 podcasts, what am I doing to myself? But I felt so inspired to create this second podcast, The Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting, because what I was finding is so many people were saying to me, I want to create a podcast, but I don't have the time to dedicate so much effort to the editing, learning new software and all the rest of it. And what I'm here to tell you is that you can do all of this and run a very successful podcast quite easily, and it doesn't really matter in some ways how time limited you are. It is totally achievable. And I don't say that as a blasé point of view. I say that as a woman who owns their own business, who runs their own business. I'm also a mum of 2 beautiful little girls. So with all of that going on, I also do not have the most time to create a podcast, but I do it, and I'm going to share all of those tips and tricks with you. No secrets, tips and tricks throughout this podcast. So for today, we're going to take it right back to the beginning, and we are going to be talking about the concept for your podcast. You need to get crystal clear on what your idea is for your podcast before you go forward. And there's a few different ways that you can kind of decide what your podcast is going to be about. But the biggest thing that I would encourage you to do is really question, what is it that you are passionate about? What is it that really lights you up and that you could just talk about for hours and hours and hours? And I say hours and hours and hours because regardless of how long your episodes are going to be, for a successful podcast, you need to have the momentum. You need to have content to be putting out there every week or every 2 weeks, every series. Doesn't matter how long your length is. And we're going to be talking about, episodes versus series, weekly episodes versus series and what have you later on in this particular series of the podcast. But as I said, you've got to be choosing something that you are so passionate about, because, it's so obvious. I'm sure you've all listened to those podcasts where it's really obvious that people are not interested in what they are talking about and they're doing it just for the sake of it. And it's a turn off for your audience. No one wants to listen to that. So first of all, what are you passionate about? What is it that you can talk about, that you can really get behind and just lights you up? And it doesn't matter if it's the first time or the 100th time you're talking about the subject, you can keep talking about it. So when I came up with the concept for the Confident CEO podcast, helping and teaching other women in business, I love talking about the business aspects that I don't feel are being talked about enough in the business world, particularly for female entrepreneurs. So that was my real calling for setting up and hosting the Confident CEO podcast, is I wanted to just talk nonstop about all of these business topics I didn't feel were being fed enough and, being talked about enough. So get really crystal clear on what it is that you want to talk about. What is it that you're passionate about? And before you think, oh my gosh, Verity, no one's going to listen to this podcast, I'm going to throw you out some examples here of podcasts that you might not think have got a niche, but they definitely do. So first of all, I am aware of a cycling podcast. Can't remember the title of it, but there is a cycling podcast out there that routinely hits really high in the charts for discussing cycling every single week. I'm aware of gardening podcasts. I know about podcasts about caring for your pet llama. I know about podcasts that literally think of something, there will be a podcast about it. So before you're thinking nobody will listen to what I'm talking about, yes, they will. You've just got to find your audience. You think there are 7 billion people in this world. There's definitely somebody who will listen to your podcast. Now, on that note, once you have decided what the topic is of your podcast, what I want you to go away and do is grab a piece of paper and a pen, or go to Asana, Trello, whatever it is that you like to plan ideas out on. And I would like you to list out at least 20 episode ideas for your new podcast. It's not to say that you are necessarily going to record every single one of these 20 episode ideas. It might be that none of them, half of them don't come to fruition and only half of them get used. It might be that none of them come to fruition and none of them get used initially. However, if you cannot list out at least 20 ideas for episodes for your podcast, you do not have a podcast, because you do not have enough content that you can be talking about to fill up episodes for your podcast. So if you can't right off the bat, within the first 20-30 minutes, even 10-20 minutes, if you cannot write down at least 20 ideas for episodes, I would rethink the idea. I wouldn't say abandon it, but I would rethink the concept of the podcast that you are planning on running, because you need to make sure you have got enough content. Now, statistically, the vast majority of podcasts will go into what's called pod fade after the first 8 episodes, and that is because, well, there's a few reasons because of that, but one of that is because people run out of content ideas. So as I said, if you can't come up with at least 20 ideas, and you think if you are doing podcast episodes every single week, that's already nearly half a year covered. If you are doing bi-weekly episodes, that's pretty much a year covered. So what I would really encourage you to do, and for the basis of this episode, what I want you to do is really get crystal clear on exactly what it is that you want to create your podcast about. And then I want you to go away and write out at least 20 episode ideas for your podcast and see what you come up with. If you can't come up with at least 20 ideas, as I said, I would be rethinking your particular podcast concept. I hope you enjoyed this first episode, and I will see you in episode 2.